Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 230, the League of Cambrai. It is Thursday. That can only mean another episode dealing with another epic fail of our hero Maximilian I. But despite a military campaign that once again failed for all the usual reasons, no money, no strategy, no luck, this time he's rescued, not by a marriage or Imperial princess suddenly inflicted with an unlikely case of backbone, but by his daughter, Margaret, archduchess of Austria, dowager, duchess of Savoy and governor of the Netherlands. In an age that featured a number of impressive women, from Caterina Sforza to Elisabeth I, Margaret may be lesser known, but could easily hold her own amongst such illustrious company. She brought together an alliance that rescued her father's lands, re-established imperial power in northern Italy, and brought the mighty Republic of Venice almost to collapse. And then did it again, and once more. Meanwhile, her father first made himself emperor in the least impressive ceremony ever, before throwing his hat in the ring to become, the Pope. On that bombshell, we should probably wind back to the year 1506. On September 25, 1506, Maximilian's only son and great hope for the future, Philip the Handsome, died. Now this was a massive blow to the House of Habsburg. Instantly, the most valuable assets of the family, the Low Countries and Spain, were at risk of being lost. Hence the number one priority had to be to shore up power in Flanders and Castile. One would expect Maximilian to saddle his horse and ride hard for Ghent, whilst focusing his foreign policy on constraining or placating Ferdinand of Aragon. But hey, there was a much more valuable target out there for the man who had been king of the Romans for 15 years already, and that was the imperial crown. Yes, in the midst of the deepest crisis of his reign, and there were many of those, Maximilian put all his energy into organizing a coronation journey to Rome. He let Ferdinand take over Castile, and he sent his daughter Margaret to sort out the Netherlands. Days after hearing about Philip's death, he summoned the Reichstag for Candlemas 1507 in Constance. And the agenda he set for that gathering was the coronation journey. Well, that was to be preceded or followed, depending how you look at it, by a crusade attacking the Ottomans, which had already taken a detour via Castile, Genoa and Rome. This Reichstag was particularly well attended. After his victory in the War of the Landshut Succession and a campaign in Hungary in 1506, we will talk more about next week, he was riding high. Never before did he have that much influence in the empire. In his opening speech, that was distributed widely as a pamphlet, he let rip. 10 million gulden of his own money he'd already spent on the affairs of the empire, whilst the estates had barely contributed a single million. No emperor since Barbarossa had committed himself so relentlessly to the good of the realm. And still one man, the Arch-Chancellor and Archbishop of Mainz, Berthold von Henneberg, had prevented him from cutting his way down to Rome, from protecting Milan and from gaining the imperial crown. And now the French had poisoned his son. It is the empire's duty to push back the French attacks, and he himself will once again give his all to the honor of the empire and the German nation. Cue wild applause, in particular from the younger princes. All this bombast and saber-rattling conjured up images of conquests, estates and plunder from the riches of Italy. The more sober amongst the prince-electors were offered yet more privileges under a revised Golden Bull. The city representatives were not excited about the prospect of yet more involvement in the Italian troubles. They were concerned about the impact this could have on the trade with Venice and the other great cities, but they were overruled by the super-rich banking families, including Jakob Fugger, who saw vast opportunities in financing the army's artillery and armor required for such an undertaking. The Reichstag was, as so often, not just a domestic gathering, but also an opportunity for international diplomacy. Maximilian had chosen Constance in part as it was a convenient place for the Swiss, who were no longer members of the Reichstag, to come in for some discussions. Now, as you may remember, the Swiss were receiving an annual subsidy of 20,000 francs from King Louis XII of France in exchange for the exclusive right to hire the famous Swiss mercenaries. But that alliance had begun to crack. A decade of war had cut deep into even the very deep pockets of the King of France, and soldiers' pay was occasionally delayed. To save money, the French bribed the canton officials so that they would offer their warriors at reduced wages. Seriously? Corrupt Swiss civil servants? These were bad times indeed. But there was more. The Swiss were embarking on their own foreign policy initiatives. The Confederacy had always been expansionist, mostly by admitting new members, but also through conquest. This had traditionally been directed northward, but after the Swabian/Swiss War of 1499, there was so much bad blood on the other side of the border, well, that same border remained fixed for good. Hence their interest turned south, to Bellinzona, Locarno and Lugano, what we now call the Canton of Ticino, places that were then held by the Dukes of Milan. And as pay became a bit of a problem, Louis XII compensated the Swiss with these lands. That in turn got the Swiss to wonder why they only got a few towns at the outer edge of the duchy when, in fact, they were doing all the fighting. Shouldn't they get a bigger share, or maybe the whole of the duchy? And what was it with the rest of Italy? Maximilian hoped he could tap into this sentiment when he asked them to meet him at the Reichstag in Constance in 1507. Well, it did not happen. But as people in the markets often say, he wasn't wrong, he was just early. As for other elements of his diplomatic strategy, they went even worse. Venice outright refused to let him cross their territory with an army on his way south. The French had just walked away from their mega marriage between Maximilian's grandson, the future Emperor Charles V, and Claude, the only child of Louis XII, and thereby ended the first rapprochement between the Habsburgs and the Valois. That meant Maximilian could not travel through Milanese territory either. And then when French agents tried to disrupt the Reichstag, he had them arrested. All in, the event fell somewhat short of expectations, though at least the Reichstag was awarding him a subsidy of 120,000 to muster troops for his coronation journey to Rome. And Maximilian began recruiting mercenaries. Of course, he couldn't recruit Swiss, so he recruited more Landsknechte. And surprise, surprise, by the time he was ready to set off south, barely 40,000 of the 120,000 gulden had been collected. Once again, Maximilian had to ask Jakob Fugger for a loan, which he received against handing over even more mining assets. Maximilian's treasurer moaned, quote, "We have absolutely no money at all. We are poorer than poor." When Maximilian asked the Tyrolean estates for cash, they responded saying that he should pay off his wife's debt with the innkeepers and grocers before he starts a new war. Not paying Bianca Maria Sforza's debt with her suppliers was a recurring theme in this strained relationship, and the poor woman found herself more often than not unable to leave places due to unpaid bills. In February 1508, Maximilian had mustered his forces and was ready to set off for Rome. The only problem was that his forces were not quite what he hoped for or needed. He had organized 3 attack columns, the largest of which he gathered at Trento, at the bottom of the Brenner Pass. That force of 7,000 men in total was meant to break through the narrow gap at the Veroneser Klause or Chiusa di Verona. This was the exit point of the Brenner Pass, barely a few hundred meters wide with sheer cliffs on both sides. It was here that Otto von Wittelsbach saved Barbarossa and his army in 1155, earning him eternal gratitude and ultimately a duchy. In 1508, getting through the Veroneser Klause was still as difficult as it had been in 1155, and the Venetians, who held Verona and its approaches, had refused to let Maximilian through. And no Wittelsbach had come along to save the day. Maximilian was simply stuck in Trento with his 7,000 men with no way to get down to Rome. And even if he had been able to fight his way through the gate, what would he have done then? By this time, the average size of an army in the Italian wars was 50,000. His small force would have been crushed by either the French or the Venetians. But then Maximilian made such a big deal out of his desire to go to Rome and to receive the imperial crown, he could not just simply turn around and call it a day. So he asked the new Pope, Julius II, whether he would allow him to be crowned in Trento, something the Pope had previously offered. But this time Julius II refused. So Maximilian did something he might have thought of as nothing more than a placeholder. He declared himself to be erwählter römischer Kaiser, or elected Roman Emperor. That was something medieval emperors had traditionally done upon entering Italy and announcing their imminent arrival to the Pope. But this time everybody knew that he would not make it to Rome at any time soon, and at that point Trento wasn't in Italy. Still, they gathered some relics from the neighboring churches, and 1,000 riders waved their flags. Matthäus Lang, the Bishop of Gurk and one of Maximilian's closest advisors, declared that Maximilian was intent to go to Rome and that he was therefore from now on to be regarded as emperor. But ultimately it was all a little bit miserable. Hardly any imperial princes had accompanied him, not a single prince-elector was present. The cardinal legate to the empire refused to attend. Not even the Bishop of Trento was willing to officiate. Nevertheless, this declaration of Trento became imperial law. From that point forward, those elected as king of the Romans used the title emperor-elect, and no one was ever again crowned in Rome. Charles V did undergo a coronation ceremony in Bologna in 1530, but had been using the title for a decade already, and after that, no emperor was again crowned by a pope. The coronations were from now on performed by the 3 spiritual electors in Frankfurt. Now that was certainly not the outcome that Maximilian had envisaged. For him, the imperial title still mattered. He fundamentally believed that as emperor he could claim the lead in the defense against the Ottomans, bringing even kings under his command. And for that to work, the dismal procedure in Trento was not the tool to achieve it. Only a real coronation by the Pope could. He would pursue this idea for the rest of his life, but never achieved it. So, contrary to what you can still read occasionally, Maximilian did not intend to shake off the papal yoke or rid the empire of Rome. That was a 19th century idea fueled by a nationalist fervour. This performance was, however, not the only glorious achievement of the now Emperor Maximilian in 1508. Whilst he could not break through on the Brenner Pass, he turned around and tried to get into Italy using 2 other routes, one through the Cadore Valley in the Dolomites and another via Görz or Gorizia into Friuli. What he tried to achieve with this is, to be polite, unclear. His forces were still minuscule compared to the armies the Venetians could easily raise and pay. Hence, even if he had made any territorial gains, he would have been forced to give them back immediately. Well, as it happened, he did not even do that. His forces in the Dolomites, about 4,000 to 6,000 men, were encircled and literally massacred. The Stratiotti, Albanian mercenaries, had been promised 1 gulden for each head of an enemy by the Venetians. No quarter was given, and 2,000 men lay dead on the field. His attempt to make gains in Friuli fared even worse. His forces immediately got stuck on unexpected resilience, and the Venetian counterattack crashed through his lines into Austrian lands, taking the important port of Trieste in the process. Maximilian had to sue for peace and quick, which he was miraculously granted in July 1508. So once again, Maximilian had been defeated and humiliated. As he said in Constance the year before, he had 4 devils to fight: the French and the Venetians, who never deliver on their promises, the Turks, honest men who stick to their treaties, and the Swiss, who smash up whatever he builds. But if you ask him who was foremost responsible for all the misery, it was the German princes. But right about now, when he seemed to be truly on his knees, his armies defeated, his imperial crown a bit of a joke, and his homeland invaded, enter stage left, the brains of the Habsburg outfit, Archduchess Margaret, Maximilian's daughter. You may remember that at the top of the episode I mentioned that Maximilian did not go north to shore up Habsburg power in the Netherlands, but he had sent his daughter to deal with it, and that turned out to be one of the smartest things he could have done. Margaret of Austria had walk-on roles in this podcast since episode 217, and even though this is by no means the last time she'll feature prominently on the show, it is now time to give her the space that she deserves. let's first recap her life up until 1508 before we get into the first of her masterstrokes, the League of Cambrai. Margaret was born in 1480 as the second child and only daughter of Maximilian and Marie of Burgundy. Her mother died when she was 2 years old, and the year after, the Estates of Flanders forced her father to sign the Treaty of Arras with King Louis XI of France. And under this treaty, Margaret was to marry the Dauphin of France, the future Charles VIII, and as her dowry would bring along several cities and counties, including the Artois. As was not uncommon, Margaret, at that point 3 years old, was sent to be brought up at the French court. There she received an excellent education and made friendships that came in useful later, including to Louis, the Duke of Orleans, the future King Louis XII, and Louise of Savoy, the mother of the king after that, François I or François I. But first and foremost, she was trained to become Queen of France as consort to Charles VIII. And it's fair to assume that, as she had been brought up in the French court, she had bought into this life plan and had even developed a fondness for Charles VIII, who was apparently not a very attractive man. Hence, she was utterly shocked and dismayed when her intended cancelled the engagement to marry Anne, the heiress of the Duchy of Brittany. This disrespect to the Habsburg family was compounded by the fact that Anne of Brittany had already been married, even though only by proxy, to Maximilian himself. As usual, Maximilian did not have the money or the resources to do much about this profound humiliation. Margaret was first relegated in her circumstances at court, and once the Pope had annulled Charles' marriage vows to her, she was somewhat unceremoniously packed up and sent home. She arrived in Flanders in 1493, a place she had not seen since she was a toddler, and she had no connection to any more. She never forgot that mistreatment, and she remained extremely suspicious of the Valois throughout her life. When she returned, she quickly developed a close relationship with her father, who she probably had no memory of at all. They shared the experience of this humiliation by Charles VIII and developed similar strong anti-French sentiment, very much in contrast to her brother Philip, who was profoundly pro-French and had no real connection with his father. The rejection of Margaret by Charles VIII now freed her up for new marriage proposals, and that's how the idea of the Spanish double marriage came about. That's the one that we discussed last week. And so when Juan of Spain, Margaret's first or second husband, depending on how you count it, died in 1497, she was pregnant. However, the child, a daughter, was stillborn. She then again returned to Flanders in 1499, only to be put up in the marriage market once again. In 1501, she married Philibert II, the Duke of Savoy. The Duchy of Savoy then extended from north of Lyon to Piedmont and was hence an important piece in the plan to encircle the French kingdom. Margaret and Philip were by all accounts very happy together, though Philibert seemed to be just another case of handsome waste of space. He preferred hunting and feasting to the hard work of governing his lands under threat from France and the Swiss. The effective management of the duchy lay in the hands of his half-brother René, the grand bastard of Savoy. Philibert had actually legitimized René, giving him a position in the line of succession. Margaret was very unhappy about that. Unlike her brother Philip the Handsome, Margaret was a natural when it came to politics. And in this period of political instability, where ambitious brothers and uncles kept shunting the formal heirs out of the way, leaving the reins of power in the hands of a legitimized half-brother, was an unacceptable risk. Margaret pursued a patient campaign to oust René. She had her father revoke the patent of legitimization and then had him prosecuted for bribery and expropriation. In 1503, René fled to his half-sister Louise of Savoy, the mother of the future King François of France. But Margaret's marriage to Philibert did not last. He died in 1504 from an infection of the lungs. Margaret was so distraught she threw herself out of a window, but survived. So for the next 2 years she dedicated herself to building a mausoleum for the love of her life, the Église de Brou in Bourg-en-Bresse. This is without doubt one of the masterpieces of that Burgundian style that mixed medieval and Renaissance into its own unique form. It took 26 years to complete, and inside you can find the magnificent tombs of Philibert and of Margaret herself. So if you happen to go down the Autoroute du Soleil this summer and you look for a way to avoid Lyon and make a pleasant stop, I can only thoroughly recommend it. As for Margaret, that was by no means the end of the line. She was still only 24 and hence back on the marriage market. Her brother tried to pass her on to Henry VII of England when he was stranded there on his way to Spain, as we discussed last week. However, she resolutely refused to go through the marriage process for a fourth time. She maintained that position all throughout the rest of her life and remained a widow. And though she had no children of her own, she brought up 4 of her 5 nieces and nephews, the future Emperor Charles V and his sisters Eleanor, Isabella, and Marie. When Philip the Handsome died in September 1506, someone needed to secure the rights of his son Charles in the Netherlands, and there were a number of reasons why Margaret was a good choice as regent. For one, why she was the daughter of Marie of Burgundy, the true heir to the Netherlands. That brought her the loyalty of the Burgundian nobles, namely the members of the Order of the Golden Fleece. She was also much more popular in the cities than Maximilian. The emperor had been seen almost from the beginning as a rapacious foreigner who had caused endless wars and misery. His children were believed to want to keep the Netherlands away from conflict. And other than her brother, Margaret was an eminently capable politician, as she'd already shown in her handling of the affairs of Savoy. Hence, she started with a reasonable degree of goodwill. She then strengthened her position by making sure she was present. Again and again she celebrated joyeuses entrées, these ceremonial entries into cities where she received the keys to the city and in exchange swore to uphold their ancient rights. Like her father, she was good with people. Thus she enjoyed sympathy as a beautiful and tragic widow. Her palace at Mechelen was one of the first purely Renaissance buildings north of the Alps, and in it she put together one of the greatest art collections of the age. Amongst her possessions was the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, today one of the highlights of the National Gallery in London. Her library held some of the greatest illuminated manuscripts ever produced, and her halls were clad in the greatest of Flemish tapestries. All these were pieces deliberately chosen to remind visitors of the heydays of the Burgundian courts of Philip the Good and Charles the Bold. If successfully maneuvering the notoriously difficult politics of the Low Countries wasn't enough of an achievement, where she really excelled was in international diplomacy. Now, her first masterpiece came in 1508. Let's just remember, her father, Maximilian, had once again made a fool of himself when he announced his coronation journey to Rome, that went no further than Trento, his mildly ridiculous elevation to the imperial title, and all that followed by 2 massive defeats and the loss of parts of his own lands to Venice. So he should by all accounts now be NFI to any major international alliance. What Margaret achieved was not only to bring the Habsburgs back to the table, but give them claims on some of the biggest prizes in one of the most Machiavellian treaties of the already fairly Machiavellian Italian wars. It all evolved or began with the endless issue of Gelders. Now, this small duchy had been a thorn in the side of the Burgundian state ever since Charles the Bold had claimed it in 1473. Its traditional rulers, the Egmont family, could count on support amongst their people, and geography made conquering the place difficult. But mostly Gelders was a problem because the French kept subsidizing their resistance as a way to keep first Philip the Handsome and now Margaret from supporting Maximilian's plans to attack the French. And that was extremely successful as a policy, since it frightened Philip the Handsome so much he stabbed Maximilian in the back more times than one can count. Margaret was keen on bringing an end to this constant problem, if necessary by making peace with Charles of Egmont, the Duke of Gelders. So this issue then formed the background for the negotiations that kicked off in the city of Cambrai in November 1508. There Margaret sat down with the Cardinal d'Amboise, the chief minister of King Louis XII. Margaret as governor of the Netherlands and representative of her father, whilst Amboise had plenipotentiary power from Louis XII. Margaret not only knew Louis and many members of his court very well from her days as an intended future queen, she had played with Amboise when they were both children. She understood better than anyone in Maximilian's court what could stir the interest of her counterparty. And creativity was required, since there wasn't much the Habsburgs could offer the French in exchange for them dropping their support for Guelders. She put aside her personal animosity of the French and she sought out their soft spot: greed, excessive greed. Louis, together with his Venetian allies, had taken the Duchy of Milan. But despite Milan being immensely rich, it was not enough for Louis XII. He had tried to take Naples as well, but had been thrown out by the Spanish. Florence was his ally, and even the other smaller states like Genoa, Ferrara, and Mantua had secured their positions through various treaties, making them hard to annex without risking large-scale warfare. So Margaret had an audacious solution for Amboise and his boss: go after Venice. Sure, Venice was France's most long-standing ally since the dissolution of the Holy League. But the Venetians had made themselves profoundly unpopular amongst the other Italians. They had pushed into Ferrara, had taken a chunk out of the Papal States, held a number of ports on the Adriatic coast of Naples, and occupied several cities that had once belonged to Milan. Pope Julius II had already put out feelers to Louis XII to see whether he could rein in his ally Venice. But it was Margaret who pulled all of these strings together. She could not only commit her father, who, as we know, was largely useless, but she was also on excellent terms with Ferdinand of Aragon, her former father-in-law. Ferdinand was keen to get rid of the Venetians in his kingdom of Naples. And if France and Spain got together, all the other powers in Italy had to get into their slipstream. Plus, the Serenissima had enough land and gold to satisfy everyone's greed. Margaret and Amboise developed a complex system of deception to keep the Venetians in the dark about their imminent destruction. They created 3 separate treaties. The first one was an agreement between France, the Habsburgs, and the Duke of Guelders. The Duke of Guelders would accept a peace in which he would hand over several cities and castles in exchange for recognition by the Low Countries. France promised not to fund any further uprisings, and as an additional sign of the improved relationships between the former arch-enemies, Maximilian was to recognize Louis as Duke of Milan, and he would receive 100,000 gulden for this service. And then there was another agreement announced that should have made the Venetian ambassador, who was present in Cambrai, suspicious. Parties established a special confederation against the Turks and other infidel enemies of Christendom, and in this confederation were to be included the subjects, vassals, friends, and confederates of the contracting powers, in particular the Pope and the kings of England, of Hungary, and of Aragon. The question the Venetians should have asked themselves was, why were they not included? But they didn't do that. The ambassadors wrote back home that all was good and one could look forward to a time of peace and prosperity. They would not have written that had they seen the secret treaty concluded at the same time. Therein, France, the Habsburgs, Spain, the Pope, and the King of England agreed, quote, to put a term to the losses, injuries, spoliations, and damage inflicted by the Venetians, not only on the Holy Apostolic See, but also on the Holy Roman Empire, the House of Austria, the Dukes of Milan, the Kings of Naples, and many other princes, whose goods and chattels, cities and castles they have nefariously usurped, as though pledged to do injury to all the world. Therefore have we deemed it not merely useful and honourable, but imperatively necessary to summon all to a just revenge, that all may unite as in the presence of a conflagration by which all are threatened, to extinguish the insatiable Venetian cupidity and thirst for domination. End quote. The plan was nothing less than the partition of the Venetian Empire amongst the members of the League. The Pope was to have Ravenna, Faenza, Rimini, Imola and Cesena. To the emperor would go Verona, Padua, Vicenza, Treviso, Friuli, Istria, and all else taken by the Venetians from the Empire or the House of Austria. The King of France was to recover, as he called it, that which he had ceded voluntarily to Venice as the price of her cooperation in the conquest of Milan, thus obtaining Cremona, Brescia, Crema, and Bergamo. The King of Aragon would be given Brindisi, Trani, Gallipoli, and Otranto, and his complicity was further assured by a stipulation that the Austrian princes should not, during the war, take any action in respect of their claim to the government of Castile. The King of Hungary was to be pressed to enter the alliance, and if he were to consent, was to receive Dalmatia. Cyprus was dangled as a lure before the eyes of the Duke of Savoy, and other spoils were reserved for the rulers of Ferrara and Mantua, and quite frankly, if they had to offer anything to the Sultan, they probably would have done that too. This was, on the one hand, a genius move by Margaret, who in one fell swoop pulled her father out of the quagmire that he'd put himself in with this stupid attack on Venice. And even more amazingly, she had offered him the wealthy cities of the Veneto, including Verona, on a silver platter. And by the way, the Pope had now endorsed Maximilian's weird imperial title. Not bad for a 28-year-old. Military action started with the Battle of Agnadello in 1509 that ended with an utter defeat of the Venetian army. To ensure the safety of the lagoon, Venice withdrew its entire forces to the defense of their city. The French took one city after another in the Romagna and the Veneto without as much as a cannonball fired. Only Treviso resisted. As per the League agreement, the Pope took his booty, and Maximilian, as usual, without any support from the imperial princes, showed up late and with insufficient funds or forces. He marched into the cities and lands the French had so kindly conquered for him. What a tremendous victory! But then the French failed to go the whole hog. They did not attack Venice itself. It seems that Louis had realized that wiping out the last meaningful secular Italian power may cause friction amongst his allies. So the Venetians were able to regroup. And other than the states it was fighting, Venice was not reliant on the taxes from its mainland possessions. Their wealth came from trade, and trade continued, so they had enough funds to maintain large armies almost indefinitely. Maximilian did not. The first of his great acquisitions to be lost was Padua. When Maximilian returned to take it back, the Venetian garrison resisted. Maximilian's forces were underpaid as usual, and the French, who had come to help, refused to fight alongside these uncouth Landsknechte. Tensions rose and funds declined. Maximilian had to abandon the siege of Padua. Meanwhile, the League of Cambrai was also rapidly falling apart. After all, this was an alliance of thieves, and there is no honor amongst these kinds of people. Once everybody had their booty, well, there was no need to stay on. Pope Julius II was the first to take control of his cities, which is why he was also the first to wander off. Ferdinand of Aragon was next. Once he had his places in Puglia, there was no need to keep on fighting. Louis XII himself saw no reason to help Maximilian to recover the cities he'd already once conquered for him. One of the reasons Maximilian struggled in the Veneto was the lack of discipline amongst his troops and administrators, which in turn was a function of his usual lack of funds. He needed to press as much cash out of his acquisitions to pay his soldiers, since these guys would go out raiding and plundering if they remained unpaid. Well, as it happened, they raided and plundered anyway, and the administrators were seen as locusts. Meanwhile, the Venetians just waited for the public anger to seethe. Pope Julius told the Italians that Maximilian had brought in 100,000 devils to crucify the country. Spanish observers noted cruelty, greed, lack of funds, order, and a collapse of the economy, and of course, a complete failure of the imperial princes to lift a finger. By 1510, Maximilian was pushed back onto Verona. He launched an attack in Friuli and talked about burning Venice, but nobody believed anything he said anymore. The horrors his Landsknechte inflicted were stratospheric. In one incident, they burned women and children in a cave near Vicenza. The population began to rise up against the Habsburg invaders. Peasant militia joined up with the Venetian armies. Maximilian's anger was increasingly directed at the Pope, Julius II, a man of great taste in art. He is the one who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but without even a shred of spirituality. So the two heads of Christendom were trading insults in public. Maximilian calling Julius a man who deserved to be beaten up for being such a bad example for all of Christendom. Louis XII, too, had lost patience with Julius II and had come up with a plan to depose him, or at least create a schism. Well, why not? Louis called a church council which was supposed to investigate Julius' alleged crimes and demanded fundamental reform. Maximilian supported this idea, and once his second wife, Bianca Maria Sforza, had died, he took the whole thing to its natural conclusion. Why not let this schismatic council elect him, Emperor Maximilian, as Pope? This was a serious consideration. Jakob Fugger was busy calculating the amount of bribes required to pull that off. Maximilian wrote to his daughter that, he was prepared to never see a naked woman again and to walk amongst the saints. According to Maximilian, the combination of the two swords in one person would unite Christian Europe in the longed-for crusade. He always kept going on about crusades and unity, whilst at the same time his troops were committing unspeakable crimes to other Christians. Most historians had described this plan as lunacy of an overheated mind. The defenders claim that there was some political value to it, as it would have weakened the moral authority of the papacy. Yes, such a thing still existed, even after Alexander Borgia and Julius II. Anyway, it didn't work. And despite French reluctance to help, Maximilian stuck with Louis XII almost to the bitter end. In 1512 he helped the French in one of the most brutal sackings of the war, that of Brescia, but then money ran out completely. And it was once more Margaret who had to rescue him. She had worked tirelessly in keeping a space for him in the next great league, once more called the Holy League. Only this time, everybody ganged up against the French. And everybody now included the Swiss, who had upgraded from supplier of soldiers to power player. Almost as quickly as the French had wiped out the Venetians in 1509, the Holy League now pushed the French out. Milan fell in 1512, and in 1513, a son of Ludovico Sforza, Massimiliano, took control of the duchy. The Medici returned to Florence. For a brief moment it looked as if the old Italian power balance from 1495 was coming back. In 1513, the Holy League got more aggressive. England, Spain, and the Habsburgs lined up for a major attack on the French. Once more, Maximilian was dreaming of his grand plan to squash the French and bury Louis XII under the ruins of Blois or Amboise. But again, nothing came of it. Maximilian and Henry VIII, yes, the Henry VIII, fought and won a battle at Guinegate against the French, the same place Maximilian had won his very first battle way back in 1479. But the march on Paris was cancelled when the Spanish signed a truce with the French and the Swiss refused to push on, and he fell out with Henry VIII. King Louis XII died on January 1, 1515, and his successor, his closest male relative, was still a very remote cousin, François of Angoulême. François was the great-great-great-grandson of King Charles V, who had died in 1380. In other words, he brought some serious fresh blood into a dynasty that was really physically on its last leg. François was tall, almost 6 feet, broad-shouldered, athletic, every inch the Renaissance prince. He was cultured and commissioned Chambord, the maddest of French royal palaces. But above all, he was tremendously ambitious. That is why he showed up on the borders of the Duchy of Milan with an army made up of French cavalry and artillery, as well as a large number of Landsknechte, including the Black Band or Gelders. On September 13 and 14, 1515, at a place called Marignano, the French faced up to the elite of the Swiss mercenaries, 22,000 pikemen with some arquebuses and only a handful artillery pieces. This battle rapidly became a contest between the Swiss and the Landsknechte, which was not just over who was running Milan, but over military reputation. 16 years after their devastating defeat in the Swabian Wars, this time the Landsknechte triumphed. They had evolved into a force that combined the pressure of the pike square with firearms and the integration of cavalry and artillery, a shift in military tactics the Swiss had refused to follow. And in the end, half of what had once been Europe's undisputed elite force lay dead. The next year, Switzerland signed the Treaty of Fribourg that established a perpetual peace with France. The Confederacy abandoned its expansionist policies and established their famous neutrality, a stance that had kept them in good stead ever since. And once more a league formed against France, and Maximilian took an army of 14,000 to Milan. And once again, he ran out of money, only that this time it took just 2 weeks. The exhausted emperor gave up and went home. His grandson Charles and once again his daughter Margaret negotiated the peace. François kept Milan, Venice kept the Veneto, including Verona, that Maximilian had already lost in 1514. Florence remained under the Medici, and the smaller states, Mantua, Ferrara, and so forth, stabilized. The papacy gained Parma and Piacenza and assumed effective control of the papal states. Maximilian got nothing. But all the Italian states were exhausted, the lands devastated and the political power broken. Even mighty Venice was no longer as strong as it used to be, and was also now facing the new, much cheaper competition from Spanish and Portuguese ships trading with the East. And down south, the Spaniards were now ruled by Charles V, who also held Naples and was going to inherit Austria. So the Italian wars weren't over. They would continue, only now as a fight between just two players, the King of France and the heir to all the Habsburg lands, Charles V. That is a topic we will return to at a later stage. Next, we'll focus on Eastern Europe and the other consequential marriage that Maximilian organized, that of Charles' younger siblings, Ferdinand and Marie, to the heirs of Hungary and Bohemia. I hope you will join us again. And in the meantime, why don't you go to my recently revamped website, historyofthegermans.com, and join the ranks of the Imperial knights, ladies, princes, princesses, and electors who, in a 180-degree tilt to actual history, have been such generous supporters of your humble podcaster. And that would earn you not only my sincere, heartfelt, and eternal gratitude, but also a readout of your name in one of the forthcoming episodes, right such generous souls as Petra B., Simona H., Herr Muski, Andreas K., Mats B., Walter H., Ulrich H., and Colin McD. so rightfully deserve.